Hey there, creepy peeps. Welcome to my channel. If you are new here, welcome back. If you are returning, you guys liked me grading the horror decades so much you wanted a part 2, so here's that part 2. So if you didn't see, I did a video 2 or 3 weeks ago where I gave the most recent, like the past 5 decades in horror, a grade, just personal opinion grade. So if you haven't seen that video, I'm gonna link it up here or whichever side it pops up. I recommend you watching that video before watching this one, because at the end I'm going to rank all of the decades of horror together. So if you should check out the first one first to hear about the other decades and then watch this one. Why is that so hard to explain? It's not that difficult. Vicky, come on. I'm gonna combine the 10s. Do we call it the 10s? I'm not really sure. I'm gonna combine the 10s and the 20s because I feel like there's not enough horror in the 10s to give it its own section. So we're just gonna combine the two. This era, to me, whenever I think about these decades of horror, I think of German Expressionism. So films like The Golem, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, Nosferatu, where human fears were externalized in these crazy, really stylized sets and lighting. But this era also saw the founding of Universal Studios, which would give us our Universal movie monster pictures, which I'll talk about in a second. Of course, there were a few Universal horror movies that came out in this decade, but maybe not quite as popular as the 30s. In terms of these two decades, though, I really love Nosferatu. I really love The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari also. But I can only watch them every once in a while, and it's not really their fault. They're silent pictures. This was the silent picture era, and I just have to be in the mood to watch them because of the continuous music and the fact that it's not broken up by dialogue. It's the perfect recipe for me to fall asleep if I'm not careful. So while I love these movies, I can't watch them all the time. So for that, I'm gonna have to give this era a B-. So like I said, we did have a few Universal horror pictures in the 20s, but I feel like the heyday for the Universal movie monster was the 30s. That's the era, I feel like, where most of us are referring to when we talk about the Universal movie monsters. This was also the decade that horror began to talk, literally. This was also the decade that the production code went into effect. So it was the beginning of horror, kind of like the horror filmmakers being forced to show this dark subject matter, these dark themes in a more subversive way, more illusion and suggestion. I love a good Universal movie, monster movie. As much as the next horror fan. And there were some great outliers in this decade too that didn't like really fall under the monster movie, like Freaks. Content wise though, these are really classic stories told in a really classic way. So they aren't, I don't want to say aren't that interesting, but they don't try and do anything differently. They're just playing like this classic Dracula story or this classic Invisible Man story, you know what I mean? But however, kind of speaking especially about the Invisible Man, the special effects and the makeup effects that were achieved in some of these movies are astounding given like the technology that they had. That bumps up the grade a little bit. I'm gonna give this decade a C. The 40s were interesting. On one hand, we had a lot of mad scientists proving that you can explore too far. And then we had horror icons of the past decade becoming caricatures of themselves, showing up in comedy movies like Abbott and Costello. I feel like the 40s were like the first horror decade that really doesn't have a theme. Like I can't really think of one prevailing theme from the 40s. On top of the two things I just mentioned, we also kind of had like the mixing of like horror and like film noir with movies like Cat People and The Leopard Man, which are usually like the first two movies I think of when I think of the 40s. But unlike the 90s where like the variety is exciting, to me this type of variety just kind of feels like listless. Like nobody really knew what to do, and that could be maybe in the aftermath of like the crazy success of the Universal movie monsters, and also could be just a reflection of the times as well. There was a lot going on in the 40s, so you know, even though people were using the movies as a way to escape what was happening in the real world, there was also a lot going on where maybe They just had other things to think about. Not my favorite decade though, so I'm gonna have to give this one a D. Then we have the 50s, the atomic age. Horror in this decade was almost all about either alien invaders or the terrifying results of atomic power. Not surprising, given they were living in the aftermath of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Witnessing the extreme power of those bombings, I mean, would lead anybody to kind of just start to think about and maybe explore the idea of like what else could be in this world, like what releasing that kind of power on the earth could do, or just like alien powers, because that was a power not unknown at the time, but nobody experienced it like that at the time. So the thing from another world, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, Godzilla, them, these are just a few examples that all saw humans either being attacked by an alien force or alien-like technology, or dealing with the aftermath of destructive atomic energy. This is personally one of my favorite decades of horror to use as an example of how horror reflects like societal and cultural fears, because it's one of the more obvious examples in my opinion. But that's not to say I don't like it, because to me horror in any decade is a cathartic experience, and a shared cathartic experience, because typically you're sitting in a movie theater with a bunch of other people facing your fears in a safe environment. And I do like quite a few, really like quite a few movies from this decade as well. So for that, I'm gonna give this decade an A-. And finally, the 60s. This is the decade that horror really started to turn our focus inward to the human monster rather than fantastical supernatural creatures. Peeping Tom and Psycho are always cited as like the first two movies to really do this, because they both came right out the gate in 1960 at the start of the decade. There was also an abundance of like ghost supernatural type stories, like haunted places, haunted houses. This almost seemed like a response to the more concrete monsters of the 30s and 40s. Like everything about this decade just seems like eerie to me. Like it's the things that go bump in the night, whether seen or unseen. I really love this decade. When I'm feeling like old school, I really want to watch something old school, I tend to grab 60s movies, whether consciously or unconsciously. So for that, I gotta give this decade an A. Okay, so now that we've come full circle now, we've closed the gap. In my previous video, I went from the 70s to the 10s. I still don't know what to call that. So if I had to rank all of the decades now, I feel like it's gonna look something like this. 40s at the bottom, sorry 40s, 10/20s next, then 30s, 80s, 50s, 70s, 60s, 90s, 10s again, 2010s, and the aughts. Yeah, so the top three didn't really change for me. I feel just like scandalous ranking the 80s so low. I'll say it again, I did mention it in the other video. Like I just feel like the bulk of the horror community right now online love the 80s so much, but there's nothing wrong with that, whether you grew up in the 80s watching those movies or you just grew up watching them because of your parents or whatever. Nothing wrong with that. It's just I feel like if I had done this video like at the start of my channel, the 80s definitely would have ranked a little higher up there. I'm just a little bit tired of the 80s stuff. Not saying that they're bad movies. That's all that is. Before I get any hate in the comments, the only reason it's ranked so low is because I'm just a little bit tired of them. I need a break. I realized though, as I was talking about these decades, I kind of just gravitated towards talking about American history in all of these, and a lot of the movies I mentioned are American movies. Not all of them, but most of them. So I kind of had the idea too of maybe grading foreign horror, like so instead of doing decades, doing countries. So let me know if you'd like to see that in the comments and I can make that happen. I want to know your rankings of these movies in the comment section also, so if you do that for me, I would really appreciate it because I want to see how you guys would rank these. I'd also like to thank my creepy patron peeps really quick for their support of my channel. Thank you guys so much. If you want to find out the perks to being a creepy patron peep, you can follow that link in the description. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. And subscribe if you're new here. And if you're lurking, become a creepy peep today. I post videos Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I do live streams. I do a whole bunch of stuff. So join us. It's a fun time. Yeah. Thank you so much for watching. And until next time, stay strange. Bye.